Joining us now is Frank Zaccanelli.
Frank Zaccanelli.
Let's welcome Frank Zaccanelli.
Live from the Real News Studios in Dallas, Texas, welcome to the To Be Frank Show. Your host, Frank Zaccanelli, has been in the world of domestic and international business and professional sports for 40 years. And as a former minority owner, president, and general manager of the Dallas Mavericks, he's been asked to comment on current events in the national news for most of his professional career. But what he and many others are really looking for is a place to find just the facts. Welcome to the To Be Frank Show.
Hello, live from Dallas. This is Frank Zaccanelli, the host of the To Be Frank Show. We're really excited about today's show. And anyone who follows our show knows that I start out with a pretty extensive monologue. And I talk about some current events, and then we have our guest on the tail end. But because of the quality of our guest today, we're going to do the whole show pretty much around our guest. Our guest is Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo. And he has really set a standard for police chiefs around the country in terms of how they're handling not only the riots and some of the other situations that we're dealing with, but when you combine it now with the defund police movement and some of the other issues that we're all seeing, take place right in front of our eyes, Art is a real expert. And so we're really lucky to have him. Just remember again, you can follow our show on the To Be Frank Show YouTube, the To Be Frank Show Twitter, the To Be Frank Show LinkedIn, the To Be Frank Show Facebook, and the ToBeFrankShow.com. So we're excited. The show is growing. We have well over 100,000 views a show now, and we're going to keep going. And I think that people are really interested in what we're doing here, and that's what's exciting for all of my producers and my show. So let's just get to the interview. We have the Houston Police Chief, Art Acevedo, who has, again, set a standard for police chiefs, I believe, in the country about how he's handling all of the situations that a police chief and a police department has to handle. Art, are you there?
I'm here, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well, Art. I am really happy to have you today. We're in a situation where the country is in turmoil. I might have you by a few years based on the color of your hair. So I'm going to assume that I have you by a few years. But in all my years, Art, I've never seen a situation like what we're dealing with when you take the pandemic and then you take the problems that we have around our major cities and policing and some of the riots and all of that. So we're going to talk about all that. But Art, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about the Houston Police Department, how big it is, and some of the initiatives that you guys are involved in?
Well, our department, thank you. I'm trying to tweet out the show so people will watch. So I apologize, I'm looking down. But we are serving in America's fourth largest city in Texas, soon to be third largest city. We're a department of about 5,300 sworn members, 1,000 support staff. We are a department that's primarily homegrown and a minority-majority department, serving a minority-majority city in the most diverse city in the country. And we're a department that's really committed to what I don't talk about community policing, because too many police chiefs will say we don't have the resources, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough time, and they don't understand that life's about relationships, and every contact we make as a police department is the beginning of a relationship. So I talk about relational policing, that we should conduct ourselves in a manner that will actually make a friend for the department, not a foe. But we're a department, quite frankly, that when you look at our department in this city that has grown in the last 20 years, we have grown by 500,000 residents. And we are 677 square mile city with only 5,300 police officers. And compare that to Chicago with 248 or minus or plus square mile city with pretty much the same population with almost 13,000 police officers. So we're a lean department. And when you're a lean department, you really rely on relationships and the trust of the public, and it's something that we work diligently to try to pursue.
Well, but under your direction, Art, I mean, I'm a I'm a big fan. We met 3 years ago backstage at a PBS shooting that was delayed by about 2 hours. So we had a lot of time to kind of catch up. But
Yeah, we did.
I followed your career, throughout the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that you're setting the standard really for how you figure out how to handle today's problems, but yet not let your city turn into chaos. And we're seeing that in certain cities around the country. And I believe, Art, that it is a situation between not only the police chief, but the mayor, the city councils, sometimes the governor. I would assume that Houston, Texas has pretty good support of their police department. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that all relationships are work, and no relationship is perfect. But this community, on balance, trusts the department. I think that they know that the one thing they can be assured of is that when we don't get it right, we try to be we'll hold people accountable. And when you look at the department, that we really are a homegrown department, we're representative of the actual community that we serve. And so, I always wear my uniform. I always say that, this is our brand. I go out on patrol by myself in a black and white on a regular basis throughout the city. You're welcome to come and join me anytime. I promise you it'll be fun. Usually start about 7 p.m. at night on a Friday night, and I'll go to about 3:30 in the morning. And I go to the toughest parts of the city, because the community that needs us most is the community that's impacted most by crime. And I think what I get from our community is, hey, thank you for standing up for the victims of crime. Thank you for lifting up the good cops, and thank you for holding up the cops that fall short accountable. It's not rocket science. I think as a police chief, you got to call balls and strikes. You've got to call them as you see them. And what I love about Texans is they like straight talk. And they don't have to necessarily agree with you if they know your heart's in the right place, and that you're actually trying to conduct yourself and make decisions based on what you believe to be right, not necessarily on which way the wind's blowing. I think that people see it and they appreciate it.
Well, you made national news, Chief, about 10 days ago, I think it was. Maybe it was a little less. But you made national news and said, hey, listen, not only do we not need to defund the police, we'll hire more laid off police officers in Houston because we need them. Tell us about that initiative, because it made national news and it was very widely respected by the majority of the people.
Look, when unfortunately we're living at a time when the extremes in this country, in terms of the political spectrum, both extreme left and extreme right, carry the policy decision making because of gerrymandering and safe districts and safe political districts. Too often races are decided in the primary instead of in the general, and I think the American people lose when that happens. And so people are making decisions based on the out of touch base of their respective party. You have cities like Austin, where I served almost a decade, almost 10 years, that have decided that they're going to defund the police. And Austin is such a beautiful city, such a economically vibrant city in terms of everything that goes on there. And they're absolutely going to ruin that city. $150 million is where they're headed. And for the people of Austin, if they think that's not where they're going to end up unless the people speak out, you're sadly mistaken. That's exactly what will happen. But here's a sad truth. The communities that are impacted most by violent crime in this nation and by bad policing are communities of color. Because of the socioeconomic realities of those neighborhoods, they are the victims of violent crime, and then when bad policing occurs, disproportionately they're impacted by bad policing. But if you go to those communities, they don't want less policing; they want better policing. And if I try to shut down what we call storefronts, my community goes crazy. You can't shut it down. And so what we did is that we're living in a city here where the mayor and the council are in touch with not just the loudest people in the community, but the activists on either issue. The activists are people sometimes that always speak out for the community, on behalf of the community. When you take a close look, they don't even live in the community. I used to call those people that come to City Hall every single week in Austin, I coined the phrase the community of 10. It was the same 10 people that show up every week, and they'd say the community this and the community that. And I spent a lot of time in the community, and I can tell you what they were promoting: defund the police. We don't want the police. Get them out of here is not what the community really wants. So what we want people to know is that our community doesn't want less policing; they want better policing, and they want smart investment in policing, in education, in public health, and economic development, work opportunities. And so we're very blessed to have a thoughtful mayor and a thoughtful council that said, no, we're not going to depolice. We're going to be thoughtful. If we reinvent the police in terms of our mission, we're going to be methodical. And instead of defunding, what they did is that they actually, thanks to the CARES Act funding, they completely restored 5 cadet classes that had been
Right.
that were going to be canceled because of the economic impact of COVID, which is a 3-pronged threat to the American people. We've got the public health threat, then we have the economic threat, and then we have the public safety threat that comes from people losing their jobs and the psychological impact of that and the economic impact of that. And so we have 400 positions we're hiring, and for the good officers are in Los Angeles, in New York, in Austin, where these political decisions are being made that are based on politics instead of evidence-based. We're hiring, but like I said on Fox News, if you're going to be one of the children of the corn, they're going to come here not to do the right thing. Don't bother, because we hold people to high standards.
Right. Well, Chief, I've been on all the shows pretty much that you've been on. And the reason that I started this podcast was I wanted to have a show that stripped out the politics. Now, we talk about political things here, and we talk about things that are really important to our viewership, important to the country, but we don't take sides. We're not bought off here by a certain ideology that a lot of the television networks and most of the cable networks have chosen up sides, Chief, almost like a baseball and a basketball game. For us, I want to be able to have a show, and it's really catching on, that ultimately really just gives people information. Okay, let's talk about the situation with George Floyd. Let's go back. And everybody watched that, on live television pretty much. We watched it in broad daylight. We watched it in the middle of the Minneapolis streets. Tell the viewers your view about what happened there.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, when a person dies at the hands of the police or at the hands of anybody, we need to review what were the circumstances in terms of the justification for or what led up to that death. And when you look at a man that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a police officer had his knee on the back of his neck, begging to have the knee removed because he couldn't breathe. And then you watch George Floyd call out for his mom, and I'm a very spiritual person who, I'm an orphan. My brothers and sisters are orphans. We've lost both of our parents. I really believe as a spiritual person, when he started calling for his mom, he's probably starting, getting ready to transition from the flesh to the spirit. And, there's just no justification for that. And sadly, what you started seeing, on the good side of it, is that you started seeing for the first time most Americans recognizing it for what it was, an unjustified killing. Have you tried to recreate being kneeled down with a gun belt and all that stuff for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? It's a workout. It is actually, it's hard to do. And so when I saw that death, I remember it was Memorial Day weekend when it started coming out. And I tell people that history, and I tell my cops, history is watching us at all times. And history is going to hold us accountable, not just for what we have said and done, but also for what we have failed to say and failed to do. And so I felt very strongly as the president of the Major City Chiefs that my colleagues in the 69 largest police departments in the country, the nine largest in Canada, that we needed to speak out against what we saw with George Floyd, and that we need to very clearly denounce it and very clearly call for reforms. And then when you think about in 2020 that there's still departments that in their mind it's okay to keep your knee on somebody's neck, that's a problem. And so this is a watershed moment. And what worries me, may I call you Frank or?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
You call me Art, I'll call you
Well,
Frank.
you're going to help me get rid of these speeding tickets I got down in Houston. So you call me anything you want. No, I'm just
Sure,
kidding.
yeah.
All
We've
right,
got a
no
great
speeding
bail.
tickets.
Hey, we've got a great bail schedule. As long consider your donation to society, right? So,
No, no, no.
uh,
I'm good.
yeah. So anyway, we've got to affect change, and here's what's sad about our country. We're living at a time where no one can look at things through the eyes of others, right? So when Black Lives Matter popped up, rather than saying, you know what, you're right, Black lives do matter, we end up creating Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. But follow very closely, because I think it's telling what the folks that have created all these other movements failed to say. In many instances, they never actually acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. And so I think that it's time for us to just step back and look at things through the prism of the eyes of others. When African Americans saw George Floyd laying there, handcuffed, they are seeing their brother, their sons, their cousin, their uncles, their friends, their co-workers. It's very personal to them. And I can tell you, when I spent time with the protesters, the pain that I saw on the eyes and the tears that I saw streaming down the cheeks of my fellow Houstonians were real. They were deep seated. And regardless of what people think, I give thanks that our department, well, we're still looking at a few instances where we're investigating to make sure that uh, we responded appropriately. But on balance, we embraced the protesters. We marched with the protesters. We acknowledged the pain of the protesters. And I think as a result of that, we have fared much better than other cities to this point. But this is a watershed moment. I don't see real change happening. And if we don't have change, we're not going to have peace. And I think that we need leadership more than ever as we move forward.
Well, I agree with that 1,000%. And a lot of that credit goes to you, and it goes to the city officials that ultimately have allowed you to do the things that you're doing in Houston. For people that, again, don't know, Houston is the fourth largest city in the United States. And it's a huge city. And geographically, it's probably, if not the biggest, one of the biggest in the United States geographically. I lived there for a couple of years. The bottom line to the whole deal, though, Chief, is this. Politics have now entered in. We're now in a situation to where protests, and I have been a big supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement. The problem that I have is that it's disjointed. It doesn't have the general overall leadership that it needs in order to go in a direction. I wanted this show, and I want this show to be a positive influence to try to change things and work with the movement. But what I'm finding is it's so fragmented. And then we get into the situation where protests, Chief, turn into riots. And that is where you lose 95% of the American people, irregardless of the color of their skin, irregardless of their religion, irregardless of their ethnic background. You lose 95% of the people. In Houston, it appears to me that you have things under control, but when you go to New York and you see Portland and you see Seattle, it's a lack of leadership there. And I want you to speak about that.
Well, I think that it's a very different environment as well, right? So, Houstonians, it's a city that, there are issues here like everywhere else. But Houstonians, I like to say that when the going gets tough, the Houstonians come together. I mean, you see it during Hurricane Harvey. We saw it during Imelda. When we had the Astros win the World Series and we had 1 million people downtown, you saw everybody come together. But I think that the problem is that uh, you've got to be really strategic in terms of the way you respond to protest. Number one, the First Amendment is a fundamental right, and we try to do everything we can to facilitate the exercise of the rights of our citizens to protest. But we also recognize that we're living in a time when there are factions on the extreme left and the extreme right that are actively working to hijack and insert themselves in the middle of peaceful protesters. And then what they'll do is that they will start throwing projectiles at the police. They'll start throwing bottles with urine. They will start doing balloons with urine. They'll start doing acting the fool and acting violent. And what they're hoping for is for the police to try to overreact, to start with multiple munitions and the tear gas. And the problem when once you start using those types of munitions, it's an escalation. That's what they're trying to get you to do. And so it's a real fine line. And for our city, what I love is, well, I remember one Saturday, Chief Finner and I, who's one of my executive assistant chiefs, and a bunch of us marched from the third ward from Emancipation Park. That, the history of that park. It was actually
Yeah,
bought
yeah.
by emancipated slaves and donated to the city for several hours. And I always, there's a song when we were younger that was the freaks come out at night. Do you remember that song?
Oh,
The
yeah.
freaks come out. Okay, there's a reason for that, right? Legitimate protesters protest in the daylight. They're not afraid to be showing their faces. They're out there. And what happened that night is that after marching for hours with hundreds of members, predominantly of our African American community from the Third Ward, as the evening, the daylight was starting to fade and the sun was starting to come down, here comes another group out of nowhere. The second they ran up, and you can find this on the internet, they started throwing firecrackers at us. They heaved bottles, and I can't begin to say how proud I was of those young African American leaders, young men in their early 20s to the early 30s that have been marching with us and leading our, this peaceful protest. They would have nothing to do with it. And I just stood back, and Chief Finner and I just stood back, and we watched as these two factions, one faction that came out late towards the evening and into the night hours because they were up to no good, and a faction that was actually trying to impact policy to win the hearts and minds of the American people, to affect positive change. And they themselves said, we're not going to have any of it. And so we continued with our march, got all those families and children back to Emancipation Park. The other group proceeded downtown, and guess what they ended up doing by the end of the night? Many of them got arrested. So I think the credit for our city goes not just to the police, but it goes to the community itself. And this is what I urge people, that when they're protesting and these fringe groups show up, you know what? Get on the ground and point out the person to the police who's throwing the rocks, who's throwing. Let us isolate those individuals, move in quickly, arrest them, remove them, and so people can continue their protests. I think that one of the things we need to work on is doing in other cities what we did here, and that's have protesters that didn't want to have anything to do with it. We're very fortunate.
Yeah. Chief, let me ask something. These people are not protesters, this second group that you talk about. They're anarchists. They don't love our country. They want to cause problems. Are they part of a specific group? Are they paid to do this? Tell our viewers, because everybody sits back and we watch it on television and we say, who are these people? And I'll add this. In Portland and Seattle, it starts out as a Black Lives Matter movement, and now you can hardly find any African Americans. Okay?
Yeah.
A lot of the African Americans have left stage right. They haven't put up with it. And so, who are these people?
Well, you've got anarchists, you have the Antifa movement, you have extremists on the extreme left and extremists on the extreme right, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, that both extremes, number one, they hate each other, but you got the sovereign citizen movement that hate the government. So we've got extremist movements that come in and they try to hijack peaceful protests because they want anarchy. They want to force the police to respond to tear gas, to use force, because at the end of the day, what they want is they want society to crumble. And I will be very clear. This is an organized movement. These people, they don't care about Black Lives Matter. They don't care about anything other than chaos. And their political views are extreme to both ends of the spectrum. And so this is a real threat to public safety and to the American people when they're exercising their First Amendment rights and protesting peacefully and they show up. The best thing you can do is either leave immediately out of the way and leave them alone so they can stand out to the police and we can take the appropriate enforcement action, or two, kneel down and point out who these people are in the crowds. And lastly, one of the things that I would hope that we need leadership in our country, whether it's the president or a governor and a mayor, we don't need to encourage people to come into cities and create confrontation on the street. Confrontation, violence only begets violence. And what we need to do is if you've got group A that's crazy to one end and group B crazy to the other end, the best thing to do is for those two groups to protest separately and not to come in and actually face each other and fight each other on the streets, because that's the worst thing that can happen
Well,
to our
and Chief, you're starting to see some of that now
Yes, we
in
are.
Portland. And
Yes, we are.
I've been on the Portland situation almost since I started the show. There's been 90 days plus of what's going on there. I'm not a, and again, we're not a political show. I'm not taking political sides. I'm not making political statements. I'm not a big fan of the mayor. I'm not a big fan of how he's handled things there. The situation really, the police chief, I believe in Portland, had to step down. Either that was Portland or Seattle. I think it was Portland. And yeah. I felt terrible for her. I felt terrible that she was literally put in a straitjacket. She wasn't allowed to do her job. And see, around the country, Chief, people are now getting completely disgusted with this. I was a big proponent of the Black Lives Matter protests. Go out and let your voices be heard. It is a First Amendment right. It's what our country was founded on. But when you take a look, and let's just take a look at Portland, let's go to that. You've got a weak mayor, you've got a weak governor in my mind, and that's not your words, those are mine. But the situation really is that now you've got both sides that are now clashing in the middle of that situation, and it's exactly what you talked about. It's not going to be a good outcome. It cannot be a good outcome.
No.
And you say,
think again about the Black Lives Matter, because quite frankly, the majority of those folks are anarchists that could care less about Black Lives Matter. That's not what it's about. It's about anarchy. It's about discrediting a legitimate movement in terms of the what Black Lives Matter is supposed to be about. It's about the disproportionate, inappropriate use of force, of policing, the systemic issues in terms of this disenfranchisement of African Americans throughout history. So it's important for us to separate anarchists, neo-Nazis, and that to put away those broad brushes. And we need leadership across the board. I mean, God bless the president. I mean, for him to be happy that a bunch of people in a caravan of his supporters going to Portland, that is not helpful. This is a time when we need leadership at the Oval Office, at the state houses, and at city halls. And leadership would require us to encourage the American people not to take to the streets, but to take to the ballot box. And if they take to the streets, to do so only in a peaceful manner, and to be responsible enough to do so in a manner where we're not going to end up with Americans just beating the bejesus out of each other on the streets. And so we need leadership across the nation. And I think it's a time for us to stop worrying about the politics and start worrying about the impact. There's a very fine line between order and chaos. And in order us to avoid chaos, it's going to require all of us to come together.
Yeah. Okay, Chief, we're going to get to the Kenosha, Wisconsin thing in a second, because I think that is the hot item now that's on the table. But I want to talk to you about something else first. I have a lot of good friends in law enforcement, and I have good friends up in New York. I grew up in upstate New York. According to the information that I'm getting, the morale in the NYPD, just to take the NYPD, is at the lowest point in the history of the NYPD. And officers are really afraid now to do their jobs. They're trying to find a way out in terms of getting to early retirement. They're sick and tired of having sand kicked in their face. I'm not a Bill de Blasio fan, and I've been very critical of him on this show and what he's done with the police and defunding $1 billion of the police budget. I've been very critical. And you make a great point that our president, the Donald, should not be telling people that it's okay for them to go to Portland and cause more problems. That is exactly what we don't need. But talk a little bit about police morale. You've been a cop for a long, long time, and talk about the morale in this country.
It's a tough time, but I always tell guys and ladies, look, this too shall pass. Hopefully we'll get some political leadership that will actually, enact some legislative changes. I know that police labor is more supportive today more than ever in terms of working with legislative bodies to impact change. But morale is a tough thing right now because, it's important for us to call out the bad cops. And, Frank, I used to say that we have a few bad apples. Well, unfortunately, I've had to run out over 160 cops here in Houston in the last 3.5, a little under 4 years. So now I'm starting to say we have some bushels of bad apples. But the truth is that there's 800,000 cops in this country and 18,000 police departments, and the vast majority will serve 30, 40 years, 20, 30, 40 years. They'll never shoot at anybody. They'll never shoot anybody. They'll never kill anybody. And they will serve with honor and respect and distinction. But the other truth is that when there is bad policing, it disproportionately impacts communities of color. Here's the problem. We're focusing solely on the bad cops, and we should do that. We should call them out. We should call out the bad policing. But we also need to lift up the good cops. And that's what we're not doing right now. The media does a more than adequate job of pointing out bad policing. But even when that occurs, for every instance of a bad incident where a cop betrayed their oath of office and did not act in consistent with the Constitution, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of incidents where we do it right. So the problem is we're doing a lot of putting out the bad, but we're not lifting up the good. And I think that we have to do both because we're starting to see a lot of officers leave in droves in a lot of departments. We're seeing a little higher than normal here, but not a lot because we're still able to recruit. But I think, again, that speaks to the city of Houston, the community that we serve. But I would urge people, let's hold bad ones accountable, but let's lift up the good because people are forgetting that just 10, 15, 20 years ago, crime was out of control. And what we're starting to see is that, violent crime in terms of murders because of COVID and a lot of other things, murders in my city as of this morning are up 31% year to date. That concerns me. Those are real lives. Those are not statistics. And we want to create an environment where good police officers feel supported and they feel that they will get due process just like every other person in society should expect due process. So we're going to continue to, in our department, we've created on Twitter, at Houston Police on Twitter, making a difference. Where when our officers do good things, we're trying to do more and more of actually lifting them up by showing the good stuff. So it is a real issue. It's a real challenge. And so I would just urge people that, the anarchists, they don't care about policing or Black Lives Matter. They just care about anarchy. But for people that really do demand and want better policing, I would also ask them to continue to demand it, but also help us lift up the good officers as well.
Yeah. Well, let me draw you a parallel. Then we're going to get to Kenosha. But let me draw you a parallel. You just said something that's really, really important. I have contended for the longest time about policing that no matter what your training is, no matter what your screening process is, no matter what your policies are, and all of them can improve. We can always improve those three areas. You're still going to get bad police. You're going to get a couple of bad cops, or you're going to get a bushel of bad cops. The answer to a lot of the problem, Chief, is what you just told the audience, which is that you've had to purge bushels of cops over the last 4 years because that's part of the process. Crossover. I'm a businessman. I'm not going to make a great hire every time I make a hire. There's going to be times when no matter what I do, I can't train that person. I can't get that person to do what we need them to do. That's just the way that life works. It's human nature. So I think you've really hit what has to happen. We've got to improve the 3 areas I mentioned, but at the same time, you got to have leadership that purges out the bad apples so we don't have incidents like what we're dealing with.
And you know what? You just nailed it on the head. The problem in American policing, if you look around the internet, you'll find me saying it's not the cops. The sad truth is that this generation of cops is under more scrutiny than any other generation. And the sad truth is that as imperfect as policing is and with the problems that still remain, this is the best trained, best equipped, best educated, and most professional generation of police officers. The problem in American policing is not the cops. It's the men and women that wear the stars and the bars that don't hold people accountable. When I got here in Houston, Texas, I told my cops, I put out a video to everybody, and I tell them time and again, if you lie, you die. If you lie, you will, and you have a sustained violation of dishonesty or not being truthful, you will lose your job. The problem with policing is that we still have police chiefs that the public knows, and when they see a bad incident, they recognize it. We have police chiefs still in our country that, for whatever reason, they won't get rid of a bad cop. I'll never forget an incident where I was asked and a few other chiefs to look at an officer-involved shooting where a drunk Hispanic guy in the state was throwing little rocks at officers. And before you knew it, these officers just shot the guy to death. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, that's not objectively reasonable. Just back up, And so I know that we made a recommendation to this department that this officer get fired. And well, guess what? They never got fired. They justified it.
Is that police unions, Chief? Not to interrupt you. Is that police unions? Are they a problem?
I think that, like our union here, they're on a disciplinary committee where they make recommendations that are non-binding. But our union here actually, the Houston Police Officers Union will actually vote to fire, will actually recommend a firing. Unheard of for me. I've never experienced that. We're a union. So unions have to play a role. But I used to tell my last union in Austin where I remember I fired an officer that shot and killed a 17-year-old unarmed African-American young man by the name of David Joseph, totally naked, unarmed. The young man, and you can find this online, the officer gets out this gun in his hand for an unarmed, naked kid, which limits your use of force options, right? You got your gun in your hand. It gets his attention. He runs right at the officer. When he gets about 10 feet, he fires 2 rounds, and he kills him. I fired that guy. Not a bad human being, but guess what? Like you said, he didn't react the way we would expect him to react. What do you want me to do? Let him kill somebody else before you fire him? So I fired him. And I remember telling the union, you're the tail, the department's a dog. You don't get to wag the dog. Unions play a role, but in some instances, there are some unions where it seems like they have not found a cop that they think has done misconduct. And sometimes they will go all in to defend that cop in the court of public opinion, not just to give them due process, but I think that they have a legal responsibility to provide legal representation. But the court of public opinion matters to everything we do. And when they go all in publicly to try to justify what is clearly an unjust use of force, I think they do that to great harm to the majority of the good officers in the department. And so I think that sometimes unions are a problem, but think back before we had some rights for our officers to the civil rights movement where officers were all at will, and you had these mayors and councils that would say, hey, you see them there, colored folks that are peacefully protesting, go get your canine and go get your fire hoses and go beat those people. So they play a role, but it has to be a role where it's pay, benefits, and due process, and not where they actually try to completely run the department.
Right. Okay. Let's go to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and let me draw this scenario. I covered this on the last couple of shows, And I've done a little bit more research, but I still think there are many facts that are out there, Chief. But let me draw the scenario. A call is made on a domestic dispute, and an officer or two arrive at the scene. Mr. Blake is apparently the reason for the call, and things ensue. As they ensue, more police officers are called. And according to the reports that I've read, there ends up being 7 to 8 police officers on the scene in this domestic dispute. Now, I've seen what the now police have now said. The police union has issued a statement, and I've read what they've said. And I've seen what the family is saying. But I watched the tape, and here's where I'm at, Chief, is that when you watch the tape, Mr. Blake is coming from the house or the backyard, and he's coming through his yard. There is at least one officer that has a gun that is out. There might be 2, but they're following him. There are reports that he had a weapon. It doesn't look like he had a weapon on him. He might have had a weapon in the car, which we now believe is a knife. My contention is simply this, and this is just common sense, but I may be missing it. Tackle the guy on his front lawn, okay? If you think he's going to his car and you think you have cause to believe that he has a weapon in his car, tackle him on his front lawn, handcuff him. Don't let him get to his car, because then you're forced to make a very bad decision, which is when he leans into the car, it looks like he goes to the floorboard. If there's a knife down there, I still think you back off. But the one thing that I don't think you do there, and I'm not a police officer, and that's why I'm asking you, I don't think you shoot the guy in the back 7 times. I think there were 3 or 4 opportunities to mitigate that situation. And you say?
Well, I don't have all the facts, but based on what you just said, if that turns out to be all the facts, I would say that I can just tell you that a young patrol officer named Art Acevedo, you don't get to that car. I'm going to knock you to the ground, and the fight's going to be
Right.
on. But in this environment, especially if you're shooting somebody 7 times in the back, good luck. So we don't know all the facts yet, and that's the other part of the problem. We have a department there. A man gets shot 7 times in the back, and they're not saying anything for days. That is, and in the meantime, the narrative is already moving in social media. I go to every officer-involved shooting scene in this city. I don't care if it's a holiday. I don't care if it's at 1 in the morning. I don't care if it's whatever. If I'm here, I go. If I'm not here, my chiefs go. We go. We walk the scene. We look at the evidence. And within the hour to 90 minutes, we are in front of the people of Houston, giving them an absolute briefing of everything we know as we know it at that time. And then guess what? If the investigation unfolds, if something we said was inaccurate, or there's more information, we update the community. You've got to tell people what's going on, because once these narratives are spread, nobody's going to believe anything you have to say. And so, in this instance, we don't have all the facts, but I can tell you that if it's my department, number one, I would have been on the scene and providing as transparency and talking to people about everything we know. And number two, the officer that fired those 7 rounds would have a pretty high burden and a high hill to climb in our department to try to justify.
Well, Chief, there's even discussion now that I've been reading up on this all weekend that Mr. Blake had a police officer in a headlock. Okay, if he has a police officer in a headlock, there's enough officers there. He's brought to the ground. He's handcuffed. He's arrested. I mean, this isn't that complicated. But when they let him go towards his car, at some level, commonsensical level, the officer has to realize, number one, I don't want to shoot this guy in the back. Maybe let him get in his car and then have cars stop him as he goes down the road. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. The answer is not shooting a guy 7 times in the back. And I'm not sticking up for Mr. Blake as a model citizen. He's probably the reason that the call, but you don't shoot people for domestic violence issues unless they involve firearms, unless they involve, the killing of someone. That just didn't need to happen, as at least I see it.
Yeah, I think based on what we know so far, it's problematic, and I think that as a police executive that has investigated officer involved use of force my entire career, I was on the officer involved shooting team with the California Highway Patrol as an investigator, as a sergeant. I oversaw it as a lieutenant, just up the chain. I've been involved doing these investigations for about 30 years. It's a very problematic It's a very problematic shooting, but I also know that we don't know all the facts. So I would say that completely lean towards extremely problematic. But until I'm shown all the evidence, I mean, what we don't know if he actually had a gun that he was turning with. We don't know all the facts yet. But absent additional facts, I completely agree with you that it is absolutely, from what we know so far, a big problem.
And you know why it bothers me, Chief? It bothers me because it's tearing our country apart.
Yep.
There is, in my opinion, systemic racism in this country.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Italian.
How hard is it to say that?
Well,
How hard is it to say that?
I'm sorry?
Why do so many Americans have a hard time just acknowledging the truth?
Because, they live in their own little bubble. But there is systemic racism. I've seen it my whole life. I've seen African Americans, Hispanic Americans, okay? I married into a Hispanic family. And the fact of the matter is, these are some of the most upstanding people. 90 to 95% of the African American families in this country want the same thing, Chief, that you and I want. They want to be healthy. They want to take care of their family. They want to work. They want to be good Americans, okay? But the problem is being black in this country now is getting tougher and tougher and tougher because we're so divided. There's a canyon-wide divide in this country. But anyone who doesn't want to admit that in the last 100 years, there's been systemic racism, there's been systemic racism in this country. Anyone who doesn't want to admit that is not admitting the truth.
Well, and I think that human nature being what it is, if you're a Christian, Christ, I like to say Christ died for our sins, and we've made it worth his time for over 2,000 years. And so I think that folks, if they were in some minds, they feel like, well, if I admit there's systemic racism, that must make me a racist, and maybe that's the hesitancy. But I can tell you, having grown up with English as my second language, that it exists, it's real. And the first step to salvation is admitting the sin. And again, like I said, when Black Lives Matter movement started, and there's some real extreme factions of Black Lives Matter that go around saying oink oink, cops must die, and all that BS, which is absolutely outrageous and completely dishonors the victims of racism and police misconduct, because it completely delegitimizes legitimate movement. We've got to acknowledge the sins of this country, because that's the first step to salvation. And acknowledging the sins and the racism is the first step to reconciliation. And that's where I get frustrated, is that how hard is it to acknowledge it? How hard is it to say, hey, there has been racism, there is discrimination. The one thing that we know that is a certain about the human condition is its imperfection.
Right.
And
well, you know what really hurts the whole system, Chief, is the fact that when the anarchists take over and the rioters take over, it gives a lot of non-minority people the ability to say, well, look at what happens, and look at this and look at that. That is a false sense of everything in my mind. Let me ask you the last question, Chief.
Go ahead.
So as we go forward now with a country that is 60 some odd days from an election, my prediction is I don't see things getting a hell of a lot better until after the election, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. Things are very political. Portland has now become a political hotbed. New York is incredibly political. when this is all said and done, and you said something in the beginning of the interview that this too shall pass. When this is all said and done, what have we learned?
I think what we've learned is that we are a divided country. I think we've learned that when we back away from the values of what's supposed to be a Judeo-Christian society, that we end up with what we have today, which is a lot of conflict. And I think that it's not until the American people stop, reset, and say to elected officials, it's time for us to work on solutions instead of that actually help the American people and make our lives better. And it's time for us to focus on uh, good policy and not what I call good primary political theater, where we have people that they want to, instead of they want to appease the extreme left, so they say abolish ICE instead of let's focus ICE on crooks and not cooks. Where on the right we want to say that Black Lives Matter, like our lieutenant governor did a few years ago, where he said that the Black Lives Matter is the reason we had the Dallas Five. No, Black Lives Matter had nothing to do with that. It's time for us to understand that the broad brushes in which we paint movements in terms of Black Lives Matter, communities of color based on the color of their skin or socioeconomic standing, or police officers simply because of the uniform they wear, where we paint each other with broad brushes instead of through the content of our own hearts and our own individual actions, we will never heal this nation. And it's time for us to stop talking about being people of faith and start acting like people of faith.
Well, and I think that we need to quit being Republicans and Democrats, and we need to be
America
Americans.
first.
We need to be Americans. Chief, listen, it's been a great interview. We're going to send you a copy of the interview, and so put it on your website or whatever. This has been a great interview. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I will come down. I'd love to ride around in the car with you. Number one, I can't get in trouble if I'm with you. And number two, I'll be able to really see what goes on. So I'll take you up on that offer.
It's got to be a Friday or a Saturday. Start at 7 and we go till 3:30.
That'll be great. I'm ready. I'll take no dose and I'll be perfect. All right, Chief.
Friend.
Thanks so much for your time. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
So there you have our show. I thought that was a great interview. I've known, Chief Acevedo. As you can see, he is all over the issues. I think it's a commonsensical approach. And I'm really excited that we've been able to have him on the show. So in closing, on Thursday, we'll have our normal monologue and our normal show. There's a lot going on. The news is flooding in terms of the election and all the pieces around our country with all of the riots and the upheaval. And, my prayer is exactly what the chief said, that we somehow figure out how to get back in the center here and become a united country. I don't think that's going to happen in the next 65 days for sure. So we're going to follow it all. I appreciate you viewing the show. Again, you could reach us at the To Be Frank Show YouTube, the To Be Frank Show Twitter, the To Be Frank Show LinkedIn, and the To Be Frank Show Facebook. We're signing off on Monday's show. I'm Frank Zaccanelli, your host. Have a safe few days, and we'll see you on Thursday.